Hello students, in our continuing lecture about the bones in the skeletal system, this lecture today is going to be about bone development, bone growth, and we'll primarily be talking about bone growth and bone development in the fetus in prenatally, before birth. And just to kind of set the stage, by 8 weeks the embryonic skeleton has been formed, except the key thing, and this will be key throughout our discussion of bone growth and development. At 8 weeks, that fetus, the skeleton is formed, but it's completely made of cartilage. And then what will then happen from 8 weeks all the way to birth is slowly that embryonic skeleton that's made of cartilage will be transformed into actual bone tissue. And so a lot of our discussion today will be about how cartilage turns into bone. And that's going to be a very common theme in regards to, it will be true of bone growth. It will also be true of bone repair and bone remodeling, in which first we form cartilage, and then the cartilage is transformed into bone tissue. And so I've even put up here, cartilage growth precedes bone growth. I mean, if there's kind of one general rule of thumb, one thing that you really want to kind of take home and remember is that during bone growth, during bone repair, during bone remodeling, any kind of time when we're dealing with creating new bone tissue, first a cartilage model, a cartilage tissue is laid down that signifies here's what the skeletal system is, and then that cartilage is replaced by the bone tissue. Now we have a few kind of terms here to look at. One, we have this appositional growth. And appositional bone growth, the bone cells, they're secreting the new bone matrix against an external face of cartilage. And then we have interstitial bone growth, in which the cartilage, the bone matrix is actually being secreted from the interior of the cartilage model, or the interior of the cartilage. And notice that again, this calcification of cartilage, it occurs during normal bone growth, both prenatally and postnatally, and also bone repair. So, I mean, if there's one thing to remember out of this lecture, is that first we form cartilage, and then the cartilage gets replaced by bone matrix. And that really is a good way of summing up how we get bone growth, and as well as bone repair. So let's, again, we'll continue to take a look at this. Another term that I'd like you to know of, or actually two terms. We have this term osteogenesis and also ossification. And both of these will refer to the formation of bone tissue. And osteogenesis and ossification, those are the processes by which we create bone. And again, we create bone by replacing pre-existing cartilage. We'll talk about a few different stages in bone growth and development. We'll primarily be talking today about prenatal bone growth. And this is the bone formation. It begins in the second month of the fetal development within the womb. And that's when we begin to replace the cartilage skeleton system with actual bone tissue. We also have postnatal bone growth. This is growth that occurs after birth and throughout childhood, all the way up to adulthood. And then finally, the last thing we'll talk about, and that will be in the upcoming lecture, will be bone remodeling and bone repair. And this is a lifelong process in which we're always a certain amount of our bone tissue is replaced constantly. In fact, it turns out on a weekly basis, about 7% of our bone tissue, our bone matrix, is recycled every week. So the bone is a very active tissue. Like I said, bone is a living tissue, and it's very active. Two more terms I want to introduce, and then we'll get into actually looking at some of these physiological processes. We have what is called intramembranous ossification, and this is an ossification. This is a bone formation in which it's developing from this fibrous membrane. This is pretty rare. It's really only occurring in the flat bones, in the sternum and in the skull bones. The primary one that we're talking about is this endochondral ossification, and this is when we have the cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage, and the hyaline cartilage is being replaced by bone tissue. And this forms the vast majority of the skeleton. So let's take a look at this. Here initially, this is going to be occurring in the fetus, starting at the week of 8 months. Notice here is my collagen. Here is my cartilage tissue. Okay, and within that cartilage tissue, I have mesenchymal cells. These are the mesenchymal cells. Those mesenchymal cells, they're an embryonic tissue. They're an embryonic cell. They're a stem cell. And that's an embryonic stem cell that initially will have formed cartilage, but then that mesenchymal cell, it will differentiate, and it will change, and it will turn into an osteoblast. And then that osteoblast, it begins to secrete the bone matrix. As that osteoblast secretes the bone matrix, so here's the osteoblast, and they're secreting the new bone matrix. They're following the cartilage as a model, as a kind of a pathway, saying, okay, here's what I have to replace. And as that bone matrix is formed, that bone matrix will then end up surrounding those osteoblasts. And when the osteoblast becomes surrounded by the bone matrix, they will then differentiate into osteocytes. And here is the mature bone cell that will then, from at that point on, will be involved in maintaining the bone matrix. This continues to happen, and then as we continue to have this bone formation, the cartilage model, the cartilage skeleton is being replaced by bone tissue. Then blood vessels, through a process called angiogenesis, begin to grow and develop and migrate into the new bone tissue. So we start to have the vascularization of the bone laid down. And then finally, as we continue on with that, here we can see here's the bone matrix that's been developed. Here are the arteries and blood vessels moving into that bone. And then on the outside, here are the osteoblasts that are continuing to form the bone matrix, continuing to calcify that cartilage and turn it into bone. Now let's continue on. Here is endochondral ossification. Again, it's going to be the same process. Intramembranous ossification, we're kind of working it from inside out. Here in endochondral ossification, we're working more from the outside of the bone in, but it still revolves around this key concept that first the cartilage is laid down. First, the skeletal system. First, you lay down the cartilage. The cartilage forms the new skeletal system, the new skeleton. And then that cartilage is replaced by bone tissue in this process of ossification to create the actual skeleton made of bone. If we look at it here we're going from week 9 up to birth. We start off at week 9. We have a hyaline cartilage, and that hyaline cartilage begins to be replaced by bone tissue. Here, this continues to happen. We work both, and this is a long bone. Here we're in the diaphysis. It's working from the edges of the bone, both from the exterior edge, but also from the interior edge, where that bone marrow cavity is. Then, as we continue on, as we continue to form, replace that cartilage with bone tissue, the blood vessels then move into that newly formed bone tissue, so that finally, here at birth, with those long bones, we have quite a bit of the bone is formed as blood tissue, as bone tissue. The blood vessels have moved into that bone tissue area. Notice we still have a lot of cartilage. And we also, at this point, start to have towards the ends of the bones, at the epiphysis areas, we have the cartilage being replaced by bone. Then finally, here at the end, here it would be after birth, from childhood to adolescence. And at that point in childhood, so after childhood, the majority of that cartilage is replaced by bone tissue. But notice we have two key areas here, what's called the epiphyseal plate and this articular cartilage. Those areas are still cartilage. And from childhood up through adolescence to adulthood, the bone growth, or long bone growth, will occur at either this epiphyseal plate or it'll occur at the edges on this articular cartilage. Let's take one more look at it. Here at week 9, in the embryo, we're starting to replace the cartilaginous skeleton with bone tissue. We have this ossification center, this bone formation center where that's beginning. It's occurring at the edges of the bone, both interior and exterior edges. Again, the cartilage is replacing the bone tissue is replacing the cartilage. Here by month 3, we have significant bone tissue formed, And also at that point, the blood vessels, through this process called angiogenesis, start to move into that bone tissue to supply nutrients and remove waste. So that finally at birth, we have a bone tissue formed, we have blood vessels feeding that bone tissue, but we still have cartilage that will remain to be turned into bone tissue. And then finally, from childhood on up through adolescence, at that point, the vast majority of the cartilage has been replaced by bone tissue, but we still have a few areas where that cartilage tissue remains, primarily the epiphyseal plate and at the articular cartilage. From childhood to adolescence, at this area, the new cartilage will, once again, new cartilage will be formed, and then after we form the new cartilage, then the bone tissue will bone tissue will replace that cartilage. Thank you.